One screen showed Trump supporters crashing into barricades outside the United States Capitol, flags whipping through the winter air while exhausted police officers stumbled backward under the pressure of the crowd. The other screen showed legal analysts in Washington quietly reading a 32-word statement from Chief Justice John Roberts. Side by side, those two images explained modern America better than any campaign speech ever could. One side was powered by outrage, the other was trying desperately to hold together the idea that laws still matter. And somewhere in the middle of that collision sat Donald Trump, once again demanding that the system bend itself around his anger because a federal judge dared to tell him no. Now pay attention to how insane this really is. A sitting president loses a legal fight over deportation flights tied to the Alien Enemies Act, jumps onto Truth Social, calls Judge James Boasberg a radical left lunatic, and openly demands impeachment because the ruling didn't go his way. Not appeal, not legal rebuttal. Impeachment. Like a customer screaming at a casino dealer because the cards stopped landing in his favor. Except this customer controls the executive branch, commands federal agencies, influences military operations, and has millions of supporters convinced every courtroom loss is proof of conspiracy instead of evidence that maybe, just maybe, presidential power has limits. And then came the part that shook Washington, not Trump's meltdown. People expect that now. It was the response from Chief Justice John Roberts. Because Supreme Court justices almost never publicly rebuke presidents directly. They avoid it obsessively. The court protects its mystique like a bank protects gold reserves. But on March 18, 2025, Roberts stepped in anyway. He reminded the country that for more than 2 centuries, impeachment has not been used as punishment for disagreeing with judicial decisions. Translation: the Chief Justice of the United States was warning a president to stop treating the courts like disobedient employees. And here's the detail nobody should ignore. Roberts never even said Donald Trump's name. He didn't need to. Everybody in Washington knew exactly who he meant. That silence matters because it tells you how institutional power actually works in America. The Supreme Court rarely raises its voice. It signals, it nudges, it speaks in careful language, designed to sound calm even when alarms are blaring underneath. Roberts was effectively saying the constitutional guardrails were being stress-tested in real time. And if you think that sounds dramatic, look outside the Capitol. Look at the barricades collapsing. Look at officers getting overwhelmed by people claiming to support law and order while physically smashing through police lines because their political hero faced legal resistance. This is the part where the story stops being about Republican versus Democrat. It stops being about cable news tribalism. This becomes a question about whether the judicial branch can still function independently when a president frames every unfavorable ruling as betrayal. Because once citizens start believing judges only deserve legitimacy when they rule for their side, the entire system begins rotting from the inside out. And Donald Trump understands that pressure campaign better than anyone. That's why this moment matters so much. He wasn't simply attacking Judge Boasberg. He was testing whether public fury could intimidate the courts themselves. And the receipts started piling up fast. The Truth Social post, the impeachment demand, the footage outside the Capitol, the emergency legal filings, the oral arguments from April, where multiple Supreme Court justices openly debated how much immunity a president should actually have. Then came the decision itself. 6-3, conservatives in the majority, liberals practically sounding constitutional fire alarms from the dissent. Justice Sonia Sotomayor didn't write like someone disagreeing over a technicality. She wrote like someone watching the walls shake. Her warning was blunt. The court, in her view, had handed Donald Trump all the immunity he asked for and more. Not some immunity. Not temporary protection, more. She accused the majority of inventing an ahistorical and unjustifiable standard that risked putting the presidency above the law itself. And whether you agree with Sotomayor politically or not, that language matters because Supreme Court dissents are usually measured like surgical instruments. Justices choose words carefully. When they suddenly start sounding like constitutional emergency broadcasters, it means they believe something foundational is at stake. Now here's where this story gets almost darkly ironic. Donald Trump treated that immunity, ruling like a victory parade. He strutted around publicly as if the Supreme Court had crowned him untouchable. The message from his allies was obvious. Prosecutors can't stop him. Judges can't stop him. Congress can't stop him. The presidency itself was being reframed less as public service and more as a legal force field wrapped around one man. And maybe that works politically in rallies. Maybe it sounds strong on cable news, but inside the actual machinery of constitutional law, that logic creates a terrifying question. If a president can pressure judges, delay criminal exposure, challenge elections, ignore institutional norms, and then claim immunity while doing it, what exactly remains capable of restraining executive power? That's why John Roberts' statement landed like a thunderclap inside legal circles. Because Roberts understood something many politicians still pretend not to understand. Institutions don't collapse all at once. They erode through normalization, through repetition, through public exhaustion, through citizens slowly accepting behavior that would have triggered national outrage 20 years earlier. A president threatening judges today becomes ordinary political theater tomorrow. And once that line moves far enough, democracy stops functioning as a constitutional system and starts functioning like a loyalty contest. Meanwhile, outside Washington, ordinary Americans are left staring at the wreckage of that escalation. Federal workers wondering whether agencies are still independent. Immigrant families trapped inside legal limbo, while politicians weaponize deportation fights for optics. Police officers crushed against barricades by crowds claiming patriotism, while physically attacking the institutions they supposedly defend. This is the moral contradiction at the center of the Trump era. The people with the most power keep portraying themselves as victims every time accountability enters the room. And eventually, that psychology spreads outward until millions of citizens stop distinguishing between legal disagreement and political persecution. Because notice what Trump never said during all this. He never explained why Judge Boasberg's legal reasoning was unconstitutional. He never carefully dismantled the court's interpretation point by point. He skipped straight to punishment, straight to delegitimization, straight to remove the judge. That leap tells you everything. This was never about persuading the judiciary. It was about intimidating it. And American history contains a very long list of countries where leaders started treating judges as enemies before treating elections the same way. And then, the entire crisis escalated from political spectacle into something far more dangerous: a direct collision between presidential power and enforceable law. Because after months of Trump allies insisting the immunity ruling made him effectively untouchable, the narrative suddenly cracked wide open. The same Supreme Court system that Trump celebrated as his shield was now being forced to answer a different question entirely. What happens when a president allegedly defies the authority of the courts themselves? That distinction matters more than most people realize. Immunity arguments are built around official acts, presidential discretion, constitutional authority. But contempt of court operates differently. Once a federal judge issues an enforceable order, the issue stops being abstract politics and becomes compliance. Did the executive obey the ruling or not? Did officials follow lawful judicial instructions or deliberately undermine them? Those questions are concrete, document-based, brutally factual. And according to the narrative exploding across Washington, investigators already had a growing stack of evidence. Court findings, internal communications, Pentagon-related allegations, public threats against judges, and repeated attempts to frame legal resistance itself as illegitimate. This is where the moral contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Ordinary Americans miss a court date and face penalties immediately. Small business owners ignore federal orders and get fined into oblivion. Regular citizens don't get to scream, "witch hunt," every time a judge rules against them. But Donald Trump spent years constructing a political movement around the idea that accountability itself was suspicious whenever it touched him personally. That's the deeper psychological engine driving this entire crisis. Not simply anger at the courts, but the normalization of the belief that laws are real for everyone except powerful people with enough political leverage to fight reality itself. And the evidence stacking became relentless. Trump demanding impeachment after losing in court. Crowds outside the Capitol treating legal rulings like political theft. Conservative justices granting broad presidential immunity, while liberal justices warned the country the presidency was drifting toward monarchical protection. Then Roberts publicly intervening in language so rare that longtime Supreme Court observers immediately recognized the danger signal. Piece by piece, the same picture kept emerging. Institutional pressure was no longer happening behind closed doors. It was unfolding live, in public, with millions of Americans choosing sides based not on constitutional principles, but on personal loyalty. And maybe the most revealing part of all this is how Trump's rhetoric kept collapsing into the language of personal grievance instead of constitutional defense. Listen carefully to what was missing. There was no detailed legal rebuttal explaining why the judiciary lacked authority. No disciplined constitutional framework explaining executive boundaries. No serious attempt to reassure the public that the courts should remain independent even during disagreement. Instead, the messaging revolved around humiliation, revenge, weakness, betrayal. The emotional vocabulary of someone who sees resistance not as part of democracy, but as a personal insult. That's why this story resonates far beyond Donald Trump himself. Because every democracy eventually faces a moment where institutions must decide whether they exist to restrain power or protect it. Judges face pressure. Lawmakers fear backlash. Media ecosystems reward outrage over precision. Citizens grow exhausted and begin treating constitutional norms like boring obstacles instead of survival mechanisms. And slowly, almost invisibly, the public starts adapting to behavior that once would have been politically radioactive. The temperature rises degree by degree until nobody remembers what normal used to feel like. That's how democratic erosion actually happens in the modern world. Not through one dramatic collapse, but through repetition, intimidation, and the public learning to live with permanent institutional stress. And that brings us to the real reason this moment feels so unnerving to millions of Americans watching it unfold. Deep down, people understand this is no longer just about Donald Trump winning or losing another legal fight. This is about whether the constitutional system still has the strength to tell a president no and survive the backlash that follows. Because once a country reaches the point where judges fear political retaliation, lawmakers fear violent outrage, and citizens stop trusting court rulings unless their side wins, the damage spreads far beyond one administration. The public begins losing faith in the idea of neutral law itself. Think about the image America projected to the world during this entire confrontation. On one side, the Supreme Court of the United States carefully issuing legal language rooted in 2 centuries of constitutional tradition. On the other, crowds outside the Capitol screaming as barriers collapsed, while social media exploded with demands for punishment against judges who ruled the wrong way. That contrast is the entire story. A republic attempting to operate through institutions, while a political movement increasingly operates through emotional loyalty to one man. And here's the uncomfortable truth neither party really likes admitting out loud. Systems built on laws only function when powerful people voluntarily accept limits. The Constitution has no magical force field. The Supreme Court cannot physically compel obedience on its own. Courts issue rulings, Congress conducts oversight, federal agencies enforce decisions. But underneath all of it sits a fragile civic agreement that no individual is bigger than the structure itself. The second a president convinces millions of supporters that legal accountability equals persecution, that agreement starts cracking. That's why John Roberts' statement mattered so much. Not because it instantly solved the crisis, not because it changed Trump's behavior overnight, but because the Chief Justice recognized the deeper danger. Once impeachment becomes a reflexive weapon against judges who issue unfavorable rulings, judicial independence stops existing in any meaningful form. Every future judge starts operating under the shadow of political revenge. Every controversial ruling becomes a potential loyalty test. And eventually the courts stop asking, "What does the law require?" and start asking, "What backlash can we survive?" That is the road democracies are never supposed to walk down. Meanwhile, Donald Trump continues framing himself as the victim at the center of every institutional conflict surrounding him. That strategy works politically because grievance is emotionally addictive. It transforms accountability into theater. It makes supporters feel like they're defending a person rather than defending principles. But history is filled with leaders who discovered too late that personal loyalty movements eventually consume the institutions protecting them too. Because once the public loses trust in courts, elections, oversight, and objective standards altogether, chaos stops being controllable. It spreads. It mutates. It turns every defeat into conspiracy and every consequence into proof of persecution. So the real question facing America right now is larger than Donald Trump, larger than John Roberts, larger than one Supreme Court ruling or one angry Truth Social post. The question is whether Americans still believe the law applies equally even when it becomes politically inconvenient. Because if court orders only matter when powerful people choose to respect them, are they really court orders anymore? If judges become enemies whenever they resist executive pressure, what exactly separates constitutional government from raw political force? And if millions of citizens decide truth is whatever protects their side emotionally, how does a democratic system recover from that kind of fracture? That's the storm hanging over Washington tonight, and it's far from over. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, share this video with someone following the Trump legal battles, and subscribe for more deep political analysis as every new development unfolds.